Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some truths are too heavy to carry alone. And sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the darkest shadows. This is the story of Margaret Chen, a woman who thought she knew everything about her beloved grandfather, until the day she inherited his house in rural Pennsylvania and discovered that love, memory, and truth don't always align. What she found beneath the floorboards of that old Victorian home would shatter everything she believed about her family, her past, and the man who raised her. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. We love hearing from our community around the world. And if you're ready for more chilling, true-to-life stories that will keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss our next tale of secrets, lies, and the things people bury when they can't face the truth. Now let's step into Margaret's story, a story that begins with grief and ends with a revelation that no one could have predicted. The rain hammered against the windshield as Margaret Chen drove through the winding roads of rural Pennsylvania. It was early November, and the trees stood bare against a grey sky that seemed to press down on the world. She hadn't been back to Millbrook in 3 years, not since her grandfather's health had started to decline, and he'd moved into the assisted living facility near her apartment in Philadelphia. Now, at 34 years old, she was returning not to visit, but to inherit. Howard Chen had died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks ago, at the age of 89. The funeral had been small, intimate. Margaret had cried more than she expected, feeling the weight of loss settle deep in her chest. Her grandfather had been her anchor growing up, especially after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. He'd taken her in without hesitation, raised her in that big Victorian house on Maple Street, taught her how to ride a bike, helped her with homework, attended every school play and graduation. He'd been patient, kind, and endlessly supportive, the perfect grandfather. The house came into view as she rounded the final bend. 3 stories of weathered white paint and dark green shutters, with a wraparound porch that had seen better days. The lawn was overgrown, and several windows were boarded up. It looked haunted, Margaret thought, though she immediately felt guilty for the notion. This was her childhood home, filled with good memories. Christmas mornings, summer afternoons, reading on the porch, the smell of her grandfather's cooking wafting from the kitchen. She parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment, listening to the rain. The house's attorney had given her the keys last week, along with a thick folder of documents. The property was hers now, free and clear. Howard had made sure of that. But looking at it now, Margaret felt overwhelmed. The place needed work, a lot of work. She'd have to decide whether to renovate and sell, or just sell as is, and let someone else deal with it. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her overnight bag from the passenger seat and hurried through the rain to the front porch. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door groaned open, revealing a dark hallway that smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something faintly chemical that she couldn't quite place. Margaret flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. Of course, the electricity had been turned off months ago. She'd have to call the utility company in the morning. Using her phone's flashlight, she made her way through the house, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Everything was as she remembered. The floral wallpaper in the living room, her grandfather's worn armchair by the fireplace, the photographs lining the hallway walls. There she was at age 13, grinning with a gap-toothed smile. There was Howard himself, much younger, standing in front of this very house in what must have been the 1960s. She'd planned to stay in her old bedroom upstairs, but as darkness fell and the house settled around her with creaks and groans, Margaret decided to make camp in the living room instead. She lit several candles she'd found in the kitchen, pulled some dusty blankets from the linen closet, and settled onto the couch with a sandwich from the gas station. The rain continued its steady drumbeat against the windows. Margaret found herself thinking about her grandfather's final days, how he'd seemed peaceful, how he'd held her hand and told her he was proud of her, how he'd made her promise to take care of the house. At the time, she'd thought it was just the sentimental wish of an old man. Now, sitting alone in the dark, those words felt heavier somehow, more urgent. She must have dozed off, because she woke suddenly to a sound, a distinct thump from somewhere below. Margaret sat up, heart racing, and listened. The house was old, it made noises, she knew that, but this had sounded deliberate, almost like footsteps. Using her phone's light again, she walked to the hallway and opened the door to the basement. A wave of cold, damp air rushed up to meet her, carrying that same chemical smell she'd noticed earlier, only stronger now. The wooden stairs descended into darkness. "Hello?" she called, feeling foolish even as she did. Of course, there was no one down there. The house had been empty for months, but curiosity pulled at her. When was the last time she'd been in the basement? Not since she was a teenager, at least. Her grandfather had always discouraged her from going down there, saying it was dangerous. Old stairs, low ceilings, nothing interesting to see anyway. She'd never questioned it. Now, as an adult with a homeowner's responsibilities, Margaret descended the stairs slowly, testing each step. The basement was larger than she remembered, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the house. Old furniture was piled in one corner, a broken desk, some chairs, a rusted filing cabinet. Cardboard boxes were stacked along the walls, probably filled with decades of accumulated belongings. She was about to turn back when her light caught something odd. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a newer-looking door. It was out of place, solid, painted white with a modern deadbolt lock. Everything else in the basement was old and deteriorating, but this door looked like it had been installed recently. Margaret approached it slowly, her pulse quickening. She tried the handle, locked. Of course it was locked, but why would there be a locked room in the basement? She'd never known about this. Her grandfather had never mentioned it. She spent the next hour searching through the boxes, looking for a key. Most contained old clothes, books, photo albums, the normal detritus of a long life. But in one box, pushed far back against the wall, she found a small metal lockbox. It wasn't locked. Inside was a key ring with 3 keys, several old photographs she didn't recognize, and a small leather journal. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The handwriting was her grandfather's, but the date on the first page made her pause. June 1974. This was written over 50 years ago. She flipped through the pages, catching fragments of text. Project continues. Remarkable progress. Ethical concerns overridden by necessity. Must maintain secrecy at all costs. A chill ran down her spine. What project? What secrecy? She took the key ring and returned to the white door. The second key slid into the lock and turned with a solid click. Margaret hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Part of her wanted to leave, to go back upstairs, to pretend she'd never found this room, but she couldn't. She had to know. The door opened onto another set of stairs, these ones concrete and leading down farther than should have been possible. The chemical smell was overwhelming now. Formaldehyde, she realized with sudden clarity. The smell of preservation. The stairs ended in a large windowless room that looked like it belonged in a hospital rather than a residential basement. Fluorescent lights flickered to life automatically as she entered, revealing white tile walls, stainless steel counters, and, Margaret's breath caught in her throat, rows of glass containers lining the shelves. Each container held something suspended in clear liquid. At first, she thought they were medical specimens, the kind you'd see in a biology classroom. But as she moved closer, her stomach lurched. These weren't generic anatomical samples. Each one was labeled with a name, a date, and a location. Sarah Mitchell, age 7, Millbrook, PA, August 1971. Thomas Wayne, age 9, Harrisburg, PA, November 1973. Jennifer Lopez, age 8, Pittsburgh, PA, March 1975. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the counter, her mind reeling. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be her grandfather's work. Not Howard Chen, who had tucked her in at night, who had read her bedtime stories, who had been nothing but kind and gentle and loving. But there was more. On the far wall hung a corkboard covered in photographs, newspaper clippings and maps. Margaret forced herself to look. The headlines screamed across decades. Local child missing. No leads. Family desperate for answers in disappearance. Another child vanished? Is there a pattern? She recognized some of the locations marked on the map. Millbrook, the surrounding counties, places her grandfather had traveled for work. He'd been a pharmaceutical salesman, she remembered, always on the road, a pharmaceutical salesman with access to chemicals and medical equipment. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She wanted to run, to scream, to unsee everything she'd discovered, but her body wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the evidence of her grandfather's secret life, the life he'd hidden behind kindness and normalcy, and the perfect grandfather facade. In the center of the room was a stainless steel examination table with leather restraints. Beside it, a cart filled with instruments, scalpels, syringes, clamps. Everything was clean, organized, carefully maintained even after all these years. Margaret's phone buzzed, shattering the horrible silence. It was a text from her friend David. "Hey, how's the house? Need any help this weekend?" She stared at the message, then at the room around her. How was she supposed to answer that? How was she supposed to explain what she'd found? Her gaze fell on the journal she'd brought down with her. With shaking hands, she opened it and began to read in earnest. The entries were clinical, detached, describing experiments that made her stomach turn. Howard had been testing something. Drugs, compounds, procedures. He'd been trying to understand pain tolerance, regeneration, cognitive development under stress. The children had been his test subjects. Subject showed remarkable resilience. one entry read. Maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after procedure C7. Results exceed expectations. Will continue testing with modifications. Margaret dropped the journal as bile rose in her throat. She stumbled to a trash can in the corner and vomited, her body rejecting the horror of what she'd learned. This wasn't possible. This wasn't the man who raised her. This wasn't the grandfather who had loved her, but it was. The evidence was undeniable. She didn't know how long she stood there, crying and shaking in that terrible room. Eventually, she became aware of the cold seeping into her bones. She had to get out. She had to call the police. This had to be reported, investigated, stopped, even though it had ended years ago. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. On a shelf near the door was one more container, larger than the others. The label read, Rachel Chen, age 12, Philadelphia, PA, October 1997. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Rachel Chen. That was her mother's name, and the date. October 1997. That was when her parents had died, when their car had gone off a bridge during a storm. She moved closer, her hands trembling violently now. The container held what looked like brain tissue, preserved and sectioned for study. Attached to it was a file folder. Inside were autopsy photos, not from any official investigation, but from this very room. And beneath those, a handwritten note in her grandfather's familiar script. Rachel's resistance to compound X12 was unexpected, must have been genetic. Margaret may share this resistance. We'll monitor closely. She'll be useful when she's older. The room spun. Margaret gripped the shelf to keep from falling. Her parents' death hadn't been an accident. Her grandfather had killed them, killed his own daughter, for an experiment, and he'd taken Margaret in not out of love, but for observation. She'd been his long-term study, his future test subject. Every kindness he'd shown her, every moment of affection, every protective gesture, all of it had been a lie. A mask worn by a monster, who saw her as nothing more than scientific material. Margaret's phone rang, making her jump. It was David again. She answered without thinking. Margaret, are you okay? You sound weird. She tried to speak, but only a sob came out. I'm coming over, David said immediately. Stay there. I'll be there in an hour. No. Margaret managed to force out. Don't. I need to call the police first. The police? What happened? I found... She looked around the room at the jars, at the equipment, at the evidence of decades of evil. I found out who my grandfather really was. She hung up before David could respond. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. The operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report... I found... Margaret took a shaky breath. I found evidence of multiple murders in my grandfather's basement, in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Please send someone. The operator's voice became sharp, professional. Ma'am, are you in danger? Is the perpetrator there with you? No, he's dead. He died 2 weeks ago. But there are remains, evidence, children. So many children. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm dispatching units to your location now. Can you give me the address? Margaret recited the address. The house where she'd grown up, where she'd felt safe and loved, where she'd believed she was building happy memories. Now those memories were poisoned, every one of them tainted by the truth of what had been happening beneath her feet. Within 20 minutes, the house was surrounded by police cars, their lights painting the Victorian exterior in alternating red and blue. Officers descended into the basement, their shocked exclamations carrying up the stairs. Margaret sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching as investigators came and went. A detective named Morrison sat down beside her. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Miss Chen, I know this is traumatic, but I need to ask you some questions. Margaret nodded numbly. How long have you known about the room in the basement? I found it tonight. I didn't even know there was a basement within the basement. My grandfather never told me. He never let me go down there when I was growing up. Morrison made notes. And your grandfather? Howard Chen, he raised you? After my parents died, when I was 12, in a car accident. Margaret's voice broke. Except it wasn't an accident. He killed them. My mother, my father. There's evidence down there. He experimented on my mother. The detective's expression softened. We'll investigate everything thoroughly. I promise you that. But right now, I need you to focus. Did you ever see anything suspicious when you lived here? Any strange visitors? Unexplained absences? Margaret thought back, trying to dredge up memories through the fog of shock. He traveled a lot for work, sometimes for days at a time, and he was always particular about the basement door being locked. But he was just normal, kind. He helped me with my homework. He cooked dinner. He came to my soccer games. How could he do those things? And also, monsters don't always look like monsters, Morrison said quietly. Sometimes they look like everyone else. Sometimes they look like the people we trust most. More vehicles arrived. A forensics van, an unmarked sedan, eventually a medical examiner's vehicle. Margaret watched in a daze as they carried containers out of the house, each one carefully logged and loaded. Evidence of lives stolen, families destroyed, grief that had never found resolution. "We've identified at least 15 victims so far," Morrison told her as dawn broke over the trees. "Based on the labels and the case files downstairs, some of these cases are over 50 years old. Families have been searching for answers all this time." "Will you notify them?" Margaret asked. "The families? Yes, it won't bring their children back, but at least they'll finally know what happened. That matters." Margaret wasn't sure about that. If she were one of those parents, would she want to know her child had died like this, in pain, alone, at the hands of a man who saw them as nothing more than test subjects? Maybe not knowing was kinder, but she didn't get to make that choice. None of them did. Howard Chen had taken so many choices away, from his victims, from their families, from her. As the sun rose, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't keep this house. Couldn't live with these memories, couldn't pretend that the childhood she'd had was real. It was all built on a foundation of lies and death. "I want to sell it," she told Morrison. "The house, as soon as possible. I never want to come back here." The detective nodded. "That's understandable, but it might be a while. This is going to be a major crime scene. The investigation could take months. Months of her grandfather's secrets being exposed. Months of media coverage. Months of being known as the granddaughter of a serial killer who targeted children." Margaret felt sick at the thought. David arrived just as the police were finishing their initial sweep. He took one look at Margaret's face and pulled her into a tight hug. She cried against his shoulder, great wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry." But he didn't understand. No one could understand. She'd loved a man who was incapable of love. She'd trusted a predator. She'd grieved for a monster, and worst of all, she'd never suspected, never saw the signs, never questioned. How could she trust her own judgment after this? In the days that followed, the story exploded across the news. House of horrors in rural Pennsylvania, grandfather's dark secret, decades of child murders uncovered, the monster next door, how one man hid his crimes for 50 years. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Reporters, investigators, true crime podcasters, even movie producers wanting to option the story. She ignored them all. She moved out of her apartment temporarily, staying with David and his girlfriend while the media frenzy raged. The police uncovered more as they dug deeper. Howard Chen had been meticulous in his record-keeping. Every victim was documented, every experiment detailed, every result analyzed. He'd been trying to develop some kind of drug, something that would enhance human resilience, increase pain tolerance, accelerate healing. His notes suggested he'd been selling his findings to pharmaceutical companies under the table, making money from his victims' suffering. Some of the families were relieved to finally have answers. Others were devastated all over again. Margaret received hate mail from both sides. People who blamed her for not knowing, for not stopping him, for being raised by a monster and turning out normal, as if she had any control over any of it. But the worst revelation came 3 weeks after that first terrible night. Detective Morrison called her in for another interview. Margaret sat across from her in a small conference room, dreading what was coming. "We found something else," Morrison said carefully. "In your grandfather's journals. Entries about you." Margaret's stomach dropped. "About me experimenting on me? No, that's the strange thing. He never did. He had detailed plans for when you turned 18, then 25, then 30, but he never acted on them. Every entry about you is different from the ones about his victims. There's affection in them, pride." "I don't understand." Morrison slid a photocopied page across the table. Margaret recognized her grandfather's handwriting immediately. Margaret graduated summa cum laude today, watched her receive her diploma, and felt something unexpected. Is this what pride feels like? What love feels like? After so many years of viewing humans as merely subjects, this girl has somehow become more. She's made me question everything. I cannot bring myself to harm her. Perhaps I am not as far gone as I believed. Margaret stared at the words until they blurred. What does this mean? "I think it means that in his own twisted way he genuinely cared about you. You changed him, or at least parts of him. He couldn't continue his experiments after you came into his life. The last victim was in 1996, a year before your parents died, and he took you in. But he killed my parents. He murdered my mother for an experiment." "Yes, and that may have been his last act of pure evil. After that, raising you, being your grandfather, I think it became real for him. Not an act, not a cover. Real." Margaret pushed the paper away. "I don't want to hear this. I don't want to believe there was anything good in him." "I'm not saying there was good," Morrison clarified. "I'm saying there was complexity. Monsters aren't simple, they're not cartoon villains. Howard Chen was capable of horrible evil and also capable of loving you. Both things can be true at the same time." "Well, I can't love him back," Margaret said firmly. "Not now. Not ever again. He killed children. He killed my parents. He was planning to eventually use me for his experiments. The fact that he changed his mind doesn't make him less of a monster. No." Morrison agreed. It doesn't, but it might help you understand that the good memories you have aren't completely false. The man who read you bedtime stories and came to your soccer games, he was real too, just not the whole picture. Margaret left the police station feeling more confused than ever. She wanted to hate Howard Chen completely, to remember him only as the serial killer he was. But Morrison's words had planted a seed of doubt. Had her grandfather truly loved her? Had she somehow reached the part of him that was still human? And if so, what did that say about her? About the blood they shared? She spent weeks in therapy trying to untangle her feelings. Her therapist, Dr. Reeves, was patient and kind, never pushing too hard, but always asking the difficult questions. "Do you blame yourself?" Dr. Reeves asked during one session. "Shouldn't I?" Margaret replied. "I lived in that house for 6 years. How did I not know? You were a child who had just lost her parents. You needed stability and love, and your grandfather provided that. You had no reason to suspect him, but afterward, in college, when I'd visit, as an adult, I should have noticed something. What would you have noticed? He'd stopped his crimes. He'd locked away that part of his life. He showed you only what he wanted you to see." Margaret twisted her hands in her lap. "I keep thinking about all those families, all those parents who searched for their children, who never gave up hope, who died without knowing what happened, and I was living happily in that house, celebrating birthdays and holidays, while their children's remains were in jars in the basement. You were not responsible for your grandfather's actions. You were a victim too, in a different way." "Was I, though? I got to live, I got to grow up. Those children didn't." Dr. Reeves leaned forward. "Margaret, survivor's guilt is normal, but you need to understand that your grandfather's decision to spare you doesn't mean you deserve to be spared more than his victims did. It simply means he made a choice. An evil man made one less evil choice. That's not on you, but it felt like it was on her. It felt like she carried the weight of all those deaths, all that suffering, all because she'd somehow inspired Howard Chen to feel something resembling love. The house sold eventually, to a developer who planned to tear it down and build condos. Margaret didn't attend the closing. She signed the papers remotely and deposited the check without looking at the amount. Blood money, she thought. Though technically it wasn't. The house itself was innocent. It was just wood and brick and plaster. The evil had been in the man who lived there. She tried to move on. She changed her name legally, dropping Chen and taking her mother's maiden name instead, Margaret Walker. She moved to Boston, started fresh in a new city where no one knew her story. She made new friends who had no idea about her past. She dated occasionally, though she never got serious with anyone. How could she? How could she risk bringing someone into her life when she carried this legacy? But 6 months after selling the house, Margaret received a package. There was no return address, just her name and new address written in block letters. Inside was a single item, the leather journal from her grandfather's secret room. She nearly threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. She sat down at her kitchen table and began to read, starting from the beginning this time. The early entries were exactly what she expected. Clinical observations about his victims, detailed notes on experiments, cold and detached documentation of suffering. But then she reached the entries from after she'd moved in, and the tone shifted dramatically. "Margaret asked me today why the sky is blue. Such a simple question, but I found myself actually wanting to explain it properly, not just dismiss her. Is this what normal grandfathers feel? She made me breakfast this morning. Toast was burned, eggs were rubbery, but she was so proud. I ate every bite. When did I start caring about a child's feelings? Margaret's teacher called to say she's struggling with math. I've been tutoring her every evening, watching her understand a concept, seeing her face light up when it clicks. There's something satisfying about that. Not like the satisfaction of a successful experiment, something different, something better. Page after page, year after year, documenting his internal struggle. He wrote about urges he fought, impulses he suppressed, the constant battle between what he was and what he was trying to become for her sake. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. "I'm dying. The doctors say it won't be long now. Margaret came to visit today, and I held her hand, and I realized something. I can never tell her the truth. She'll find it eventually. I'm not naive enough to think those rooms will stay hidden forever. But I can't be the one to destroy her innocence. Let her remember me as the grandfather who loved her, even if she'll eventually learn I was a monster too. Maybe that's my final act of love, letting her have the good memories for as long as possible. She changed me, made me better, even if I could never be truly good. That has to count for something. I hope it counts for something." Margaret closed the journal and sat in silence for a long time. The sun set and the kitchen grew dark around her, but she didn't move. She thought about love and evil, about change and redemption, about whether a person could be two contradictory things at once. In the end, she decided that Morrison had been right. Her grandfather was complex. He was a serial killer who had tortured and murdered children. He was also a man who had genuinely loved his granddaughter, and been changed by that love. Both truths existed simultaneously, and accepting one didn't mean excusing the other. She would never forgive what he'd done. She would carry the weight of his victims' deaths for the rest of her life. But she could also acknowledge that the good memories were real, that the love had been real, and that somewhere in that twisted mind, Howard Chen had found a piece of humanity worth holding on to. It didn't make anything better. It didn't bring anyone back. It didn't heal the trauma or erase the horror, but it gave her something to build on, a foundation of truth, however uncomfortable, to replace the foundation of lies she'd been living on. Margaret Walker, no longer Chen, would spend the rest of her life trying to honor her grandfather's victims, working with organizations that searched for missing children, advocating for cold case investigations, speaking out about the ways evil can hide in plain sight. It was her penance and her purpose. And late at night, when the world was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, she would sometimes remember the good times, the bedtime stories, the soccer games, the patient tutoring sessions, and allow herself to grieve for the grandfather she'd loved, while never forgetting the monster he'd been. Because that was the truth she'd learned in that terrible basement. People are capable of both great evil and genuine love, and sometimes those two things coexist in the same person, in the same heart, creating a contradiction that can never be fully resolved or understood. The perfect grandfather had never existed, but a grandfather who loved her despite his nature, who fought his demons for her sake, who chose to be better because of her, that man had been real. And Margaret would have to find a way to live with that truth for the rest of her days.